Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So my presentation today is on a somewhat unknown aspect of the Menzies legacy, the creation of Australia's Secret Intelligence Service, our nation's foreign spy agency, which Menzies established 70 years ago. ASIS is a secret service in the British tradition, which includes the UK's SIS, or Secret Intelligence Service, and other Western spy agencies. It carries out two related yet distinct sets of activities: the stealing of secrets to create intelligence, and the conduct of activities to secretly shape and disrupt external events. The former we call espionage, the latter is typically referred to as covert action. Australian governments carried out secret intelligence collection even prior to Federation, but the idea of a dedicated secret intelligence service, modelled on Britain's MI6, was first advocated to External Affairs Minister H.V. Evatt in approximately 1947. It was suggested to him by an enterprising young military officer named Alfred Deakin Brooks, the grandson of Australia's second Prime Minister. Evatt was unsupportive of Brooks's idea. He and Prime Minister Shifley were distrusting of men who dominated the British intelligence community. They would tussle extensively with MI6, MI5, the CIA in 1947 and 1948 over the issue of Soviet spies in the Australian government. And they regarded the British service, the British intelligence services, as being populated by the same type of entitled patricians who had flung Australia's working men against German machine guns in the Great War, or who in World War II conspired with Churchill to withhold Australia's Middle East divisions from returning to the Pacific. The crisis of Soviet infiltration would eventually lead to the establishment of ASIO, Australia's domestic spy agency. While this was taking place, Menzies and Richard Casey were laying the groundwork for the 1949 election campaign, which would place a strong emphasis on anti-communism and national security. By 1947, Casey was the federal director of the Liberal Party. He would also eventually be pre-selected for the seat of La Trobe for the Liberal Party. He had served extensively overseas and in the 1920s had previously been embedded by Prime Minister Bruce in the UK Cabinet and Foreign Offices as Australia's representative in London. Here he had seen firsthand the value of secret intelligence. In his capacity as federal director, he employed Alfred Brooks in October 1947 as, quote, a specialist officer on the staff of the Federal Secretariat to deal with foreign affairs, imperial defence and subversive activities. These were doubtless strange things for a political party to employ someone for, but it makes more sense when we consider the Liberal Party's agenda for the 1949 campaign. As you've heard, banning the Communist Party of Australia was one of the Liberal Party's central campaign commitments, and the proxy wars and geopolitical tensions of the early Cold War placed foreign affairs, if not front of mind for voters, definitely at the forefront for Menzies, Casey, and other Liberal candidates who had held leadership positions throughout the Second World War. While preparing foreign affairs research papers for the party and working closely with Casey, Brooks would later express his desire to be pre-selected as a Liberal Party candidate for a Melbourne seat at the 1949 election, although this did not come to pass. We know that immediately after Menzies' election victory, Brooks advocated directly to Casey and Menzies to set up ASIS in 1950. But it is quite possible that Brooks lobbied for ASIS prior to the election win and while employed by the party. He had been forward-leaning in putting the idea to Evatt several years earlier, and it's almost inconceivable that he and Casey, if not Menzies, wouldn't have discussed the general idea of an Australian Secret Service prior to the election. It raises the following question: could the establishment of ASIS have been a secret election policy? Whether Menzies or Casey became firmly settled on the idea prior to being in government or discussed it more widely within the party is thus far unknown. However, I think it's fair to say that establishing ASIS was a distinctly Liberal Party policy, not just because of Casey and Brooks's enthusiasm for the idea, but because it is difficult to conceive that Chifley's government would have set up ASIS if they were re-elected. This is because of the poor relationship Chifley and Evatt had with the British intelligence community, but also Evatt's multiple rejections of the proposal to create an Australian Secret Service. As mentioned, the idea to establish ASIS should be conceived of in the context of a wider agenda of national security reform undertaken by Menzies' government, which included the goal of banning the Communist Party, but also preparing Australia for a Third World War. Upon being elected, Casey was appointed as Menzies' Minister for National Development, not External Affairs, as one might have assumed, given his experience and passion for world affairs. That portfolio went to Percy Spender. So Casey's subsequent leadership within Cabinet for setting up ACES is a little strange. However, in this portfolio, we need to think of Casey as the minister responsible for preparing Australia for a Third World War. At the time of the Menzies government coming to power, the Malayan emergency was taking place to Australia's near north, and the Korean War would break out shortly after in June 1950. Rehabilitating Japan was also still a huge focus for Australian, British and American foreign policy, and suspicion of what future path Japan might take was still very present. Nuclear weapons were proliferating and advancing at great speed. Australia's capacity to deal with its changing world required the rapid development of its fuel security, port infrastructure, mining and manufacturing, all of which fell into the National Development Portfolio under Casey. So too did policy consideration for Australia developing nuclear technology and infrastructure, remembering at this time Australia adopting nuclear weapons was still a distinct possibility. And the focus on developing Australia was not just about Australia's own security, it was about its contribution to Allied efforts to shape the region. Therefore, by virtue of his portfolio, as well as his past interests, Casey was fixed on issues of strategy and geopolitics, which were closely affected by secret intelligence and covert activity. The importance of ACES to Menzies' national security agenda is evidenced by the fact that on the same day Menzies introduced the bill to ban the Communist Party of Australia, he meets with Casey, Spender, Philip McBride and Brooks to discuss how to take the idea to the full cabinet. Casey briefed cabinet on the proposal with the Malayan emergency as the context, describing how a communist insurgency so close to Australia's borders and impacting a Commonwealth territory, there was an urgent need for secret intelligence and covert operations. Cabinet agreed to explore how the agency should be set up with support from MI6, and Brooks is dispatched to the UK to learn how MI6 operates and is structured. At this stage, the exact scope of work and the structure of ACES is still contested within the civil service. The Department of Defence is initially of the view that any special operations function should rest with the military, while External Affairs is resistant of the need for foreign intelligence altogether, believing that diplomatic reporting should be sufficient. In 1950, Menzies wrote to UK Prime Minister Clement Attlee saying, quote, "I have decided to establish a secret intelligence service which, when organised, will operate in Southeast Asia and in Pacific areas adjacent to Australia. Recent developments in Asia and our near north make this a prudent and urgent measure. I trust that the establishment of an Australian service may in some small measure reduce the onerous worldwide commitments of the United Kingdom." While it would be a small boutique agency, ACES nevertheless reflected the focus of Menzies' wider foreign policy, which was dedicated to the preservation of British power in the Asia Pacific and the centrality of British power to the Cold War struggle for the region. In this sense, ACES was envisaged as an empire agency that would plug into and support the intelligence needs not just of Australia, but of the wider British Commonwealth. Behind this was Australia's larger aspiration to lead in the formation of Commonwealth strategic decision-making related to its region. So, adding more to the intelligence picture would lend valuable decision-making leverage for the Australian government. But while Menzies and the Cabinet had decided in principle to establish ACES, the structure and scope of the service is contested for a year or so. The key contested details were, should ACES be responsible for covert action, or should that be with Defence? Should it operate under a Foreign Service Act, as Percy Spender initially suggested? Who should be the responsible minister, Defence or External Affairs? And should ACES use diplomatic cover, that is to say, operating under the assumed identity of diplomats abroad? These issues were resolved, temporarily at least, when Casey took over as Minister for External Affairs, and he pushes for a final decision on the form ACES should take. The consensus decision emerged that the Defence Minister, in consultation with the External Affairs Minister and Prime Minister, via a special subcommittee of Cabinet, would be responsible for ACES's operations. ACES's officers would operate with diplomatic cover, including British cover, but its budget would be provided by Defence. Menzies finally created ACES through an order of the Governor-General's Executive Council on 13th of May 1952, not via an act as Spender had suggested. Alfred Brooks is made first Director-General at just 32 years old. Creating ACES in this way, via an executive order, not an act, meant that the Prime Minister had it signed into being without informing Parliament. This not only reflected the high secrecy of the service, but also the often unilateral way Menzies wielded the executive power of the Prime Ministership when it came to national security decisions. Menzies did not regard it as necessary for ordinary members of Parliament to know that an Australian Secret Intelligence Service had been established. Indeed, given his suspicions of some members of the Labor Party, he may not have trusted them with such knowledge. However, creating ASIS without legislation had the potentially unlawful result of the government concealing the service's funding in the defence budget to keep it secret from Parliament. Alongside the executive order creating ASIS, Menzies issued an accompanying top secret directive or charter explaining in more detail the agency's functions. In his first top secret directive to Brooks in 1952, Menzies outlined that the purpose of ASIS would be the collection of secret intelligence, espionage, and the carrying out of special operations that, quote, afford no proof of the instigation of the government, what we describe today as a covert action. Importantly, the directive also instructed that ASIS would work closely with SIS and that Brooks would have direct access to relevant cabinet ministers, essentially allowing him to go around departmental secretaries. ASIS starts small in 1952, initially with 9 officers, but it had extensive access to MI6's intelligence products and stations in the region. ASIS would eventually establish stations of its own, the first being in Jakarta, Tokyo, and Bangkok, and another office in Australia for debriefing returning expatriates. Casey would initially revel in being in charge of this agency. On his travels abroad, MI6 found Casey to be the most enthusiastic visitor, and he frequently hosted visiting MI6 and CIA officers at his farm in Berwick, where it was rumoured that he allowed ASIS to use his private airstrip for unregistered black flights. As ASIS expanded, it created a covert radio station outside Darwin in 1953 to receive encoded communications and, over time, support the interception of neighbouring countries' signals. By 1954, ASIS had 19 intelligence officers and 22 supporting staff. Its close relationship with MI6 was added to with the first CIA liaison officer assigned to ASIS. Despite its steady growth, Brooks would run into trouble with his bureaucratic counterparts almost immediately. These particularly included Frederick Shedden, Secretary of Defence, Alan Watt, Secretary of External Affairs, and Arthur Tang, the Deputy Secretary of External Affairs. The main issues at play were responsibility for ASIS's funding and its use of diplomatic cover. ASIS had a somewhat confusing structure. It resided in the Department of Defence under the cover of the Central Plan section, and it had its funding hidden in the defence budget, but its officers were to work abroad out of British and Australian embassies and high commissions while using diplomatic cover, but they would often only be accountable to MI6 officers. Initially, this structural separation from ASIS was looked on as a good thing from the Mandarins, External Affairs and Defence, who wanted little to do with ASIS, but this would quickly change. Alfred Brooks was a remarkable man. His experiences of Australia's region during the war made him incredibly worldly for his age. He was confident, cool under pressure, and charismatic, many of the features of an effective spy master. However, his desire for swift action meant he chafed against the hierarchy of the civil service, and his preference for relying on his personal relationships with Casey and Menzies put him offside with those departmental secretaries who were technically his superiors. In his contest with Defence and External Affairs, Brooks directly complained to Menzies about the institutional rivalry. He sought the PM's intervention by asking that instead of being placed under Defence, ASIS should simply be directly responsible to Menzies. However, due to Watt and Tang's concern of ASIS's use of diplomatic cover, it was moved to External Affairs in 1954. Another issue for Brooks was his relationship with Casey, which was initially very close. Theirs was the correspondence of 2 close friends, one the elder mentor to the other, and very frequently Casey turned to Brooks for policy advice on topics well outside of Brooks's purview as DG ASIS. Brooks also volunteered advice to Casey on how to engage with Casey's UK and US counterparts without consulting External Affairs. In this context, Brooks would write an extraordinary letter to Casey in 1955 on his view of the ideal role of a secret service within the wider public service. Brooks argued that ASIS should be the central agency for setting national security and foreign policy. He argued that Australia needed a strong capacity to deploy economic and psychological warfare against communist-aligned states. The final straw came, however, in 1957, when Brooks took the extraordinary step of flying to Washington to meet with the US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the Director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, without engaging with his external affairs and defense counterparts. Among other things, he discussed with the Dulles brothers the sensitive and politically charged issue of potentially using Australia as a base for long-range nuclear weapons. It's ambiguous how much Casey knew or approved of this engagement by Brooks. It's certainly possible Brooks was dispatched at Casey's insistence to broker the sensitive proposal without the knowledge of the wider bureaucracy. Regardless, this engagement was seen by Watt and Shedden as an irrecoverable act of roguishness. It appears that at this time, Casey also became less favourable to ACIS's operations. Brooks would explain in later years that Casey appeared to have become terrified that an ACIS agent using diplomatic cover would be exposed, and that as the minister responsible, it would lead to his removal from office. In 1957, while Menzies was absent for surgery, a number of cabinet ministers, including Casey, met with Shedden and Watt and decided to abolish ACIS. It's not clear if Menzies' absence was directly exploited. What preceded was a flurry of activity in Canberra, London and Washington to prevail upon Menzies and save ACIS at the 11th hour. The DG of ASIO, Colonel Charles Spry, an old friend of Brooks, argued vehemently to keep ACIS, but with important restructuring, which included the sacking of Brooks. Meanwhile, Australia's ambassador to DC, Casey's old rival Percy Spender, was informed by the US State Department of their grave concern at Australia's decision. The CIA directly lobbied Casey against the disbandment. The strongest lobbying, however, came from MI6. The Vice Chief of SIS, Sir James Easton, came in person to Canberra for a 5-day blitz of Australia's politicians and senior public servants, and he attended to Casey personally at his farm in Berwick. The message from MI6 and CIA was that without ACIS, Australia could not expect privileged access to their top-secret intelligence. The intelligence relationship was still recovering from the Soviet infiltration of the 1940s, and a trusted Australian Secret Service, along with ASIO, were seen as pivotal to rebuilding trust and access for Australia. So it was that Menzies overturned his colleague's decision and ACIS was saved, but not with Brooks at the helm. So the story of Menzies' creation of ACIS 70 years ago reveals a government contending with many of the same issues concerning secret statecraft that Australia's government today still grapples with. Covert action and espionage are controversial tools of statecraft for a liberal democracy. For Menzies, they were seen as tools to find influence and advantage in a fast-changing, uncertain and hostile world dominated by the Cold War. Today, our outlook is not too dissimilar, given events in the South Pacific and further afield. ACIS as a tool of British power in the Asia Pacific and an asset for the Commonwealth adds complexity, I think, to our typical view of post-war Australian foreign policy being derivative of the Americans. The modern-day separation of intelligence and policy is very far from Brooks's view that the clandestine services, as he called them, should be at the centre of policy making. Finally, what I hope this study of ACIS's creation shows is that studying Australia's secret statecraft is possible, and indeed it is sorely needed because today, like Menzies' time, hidden tools of shaping and understanding the world are again critical to achieving national advantage in a contested era. Thank you.
Very, very good timekeeping. Does anyone have any questions for Will? Stephen?
Too enthusiastic.
Great, thank you very much. That was fascinating. Needless to say, like most people in this room, incidentally, I'm Stephen Wilkes from the ANU, fellow ANU staff member. I work, amongst other things, on the Australian Dictionary of Biography. I've never heard of Brooks at all, despite having in my professional career as in the public service the occasional slight contact, fleetingly, with ACIS officers. Shock horror, he's not in the Australian Dictionary of Biography.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you the classic historian's question. What are the sources available on this guy?
Well, Richard Casey's diaries are are one of the biggest sources, because Casey was a obsessive diarist. Menzies was frustrated with how much Casey would write out incredibly detailed diary entries and then distribute them around as kind of like he's running his own intel. But so Casey's diaries are really the pillar for actually getting any insight into Brooks. There's actually only like one photo of him that seems to be publicly available. Like I've spoken to his sons, and they say that he's got papers. There's papers at one of their houses that no one's really gone through. So I'm sure that there's something to be discovered. But you're right. No, we need to learn more about it. But the thing was, his career as a spy master ends. He's not even 40. So he goes off and has a completely new career. Just after, yeah.
Paul, just wait for the mic.
So,
where did he go?
So I believe so. Alfred Brooks is part of the descendants of Alfred Deakin, and the Brooks family is obviously very, very well established in Melbourne society at the time. I believe his sister had established a kind of a fortune around baby formula, and so he goes into her business and sells baby formula. But he also sets up a think tank that he calls the Pacific Forum, which I believe actually still operates. Which it's kind of interesting how much he actually departed this clandestine space, right? Because ASIS and other intelligence services historically have used front organizations. I'm just wildly speculating, but it's entirely possible that he didn't leave the employ of the secret services entirely. No, I don't think you can, to be honest. Yeah.
Considering you say that ASIS was sort of meant to plug into what Britain was doing, how does ASIS and what Australia was doing compare to the other dominions?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, ASIS is set up much earlier than other comparable intelligence services, and say, for example, Canada doesn't have that. CSIS doesn't have the same kind of foreign intelligence collection function even today that ASIS has. I don't actually know when New Secret Intelligence Service was set up, but again, they're much smaller. So it actually is pretty distinct, really. It's really the only counterparts are CIA and MI6. Yeah.
Thanks very much. That was an excellent paper. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You touched on the establishment, I guess, of ASIS in terms of Brooks's lobbying and the connection with the domestic situation in terms of the Liberal Party platform of the national security threat communism. But this period that you're focusing on marks a really interesting intersection between how Australia starts to evaluate where its defence interests lie in terms of looking at Britain versus looking at the US. So how much is there a shift, I guess, in terms of looking at this from an alliance management point of view versus an initial sort of domestic national security threat point of view? And does that influence, you sort of alluded to it, but does that influence the need to sustain ASIS subsequently?
Yeah, definitely. But it's perceived, I suppose, as the alliance management. The alliance that they're seeking to manage isn't US, it's Britain. It's to try and keep Britain in the region. So it's saying we've got all these British territories to our north. We've got to keep an eye on them because of communist insurgencies and these sorts of things. So if we carry more of the load in terms of foreign intelligence and covert action in our region, that lightens the load for MI6. But it also draws them in terms of operations, joint operations as well. So I think this was conceived of as, well, in the post-war era, we want Britain to be one of the hegemonic powers in the Asia-Pacific, and we know that the war's battered them around and they don't have the same kind of presence they used to have. So we need to find opportunities to kind of carry the load ourselves. It's really not until I think you get to, when it gets to the Vietnam War and we're undertaking operations, very solely with the Americans, that you have a really firm pivot, I think, to partnerships with the CIA, for example. So, for example, there's times when the CIA withdraw from Vietnam and they hand over their sources to ASIS to manage, because there's no one else really, because the Britain's obviously not there because they weren't involved.
Well, I had a question. You said that Brooks wanted ASIS to be at the centre of Australia's foreign policy and defence policy making. I'm a former DPAT officer, and my understanding is that intelligence products should be used just as a source of information, actually not as a driver of the policy. The policy should come from policy analysts, or not analysts, policy executives in the Foreign Affairs Department, for example, and that the intelligence is just like a newspaper article, or it's another source of information to inform your decisions. So how did that change then from Brooks's sort of initial push to then much more of a discipline around how the Australian government and policymakers used intelligence products?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because obviously today, there is a very clear air gap between those making the policy decisions and intelligence. I think Brooks was exposed to kind of people like Wild Bill Donovan, who had set up the OSS during the Second World War, and the CIA, who was of a similar mind of I've got all the operational capability, I've got all the intelligence, I'll go make the decisions. And similarly, I think that there was a similar cohort of people in MI6 who had kind of during the war had been responsible for a lot of, they've been generating the intelligence and then acting on it themselves. I think for the Australian system, the intelligence community doesn't mature properly in Australia until the 70s, until you have the Hope Royal Commission. I think it is in the Hope Royal Commission that he lays down very clearly the need to have that separation of intelligence and policy. But prior to that, it's pretty slapdash. I mean, there's even stories that Billy McMahon, for example, when he became Prime Minister, thought there was more than one ASIS, because everyone had kept talking about this agency with different, wink, wink, kind of nudge, nudge pseudonyms, that he was like, how many of these agencies do we have? So, it was kind of that kind of amateurish and disorganized.
George?
Well, congratulations, that was terrific. Can I ask you to expand a little on your observation that Evatt and Chifley were reluctant to establish ASIS because of their, I think you said, their perception that this was MI6 was an elitist British, a toffee-nosed institution. They didn't have a similar reluctance about establishing ASIO, which was established largely at the encouragement of MI5 and Sir Roger Hollis in particular. Is that because they culturally viewed MI6 as different from MI5 and being sort of more elitist or toffee-nosed, or or do we have any understanding of why they were prepared to have a domestic spy agency, which arguably would have been more offensive to Evatt's civil libertarian pretensions, but not prepared to have a foreign intelligence agency?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and the two are very much interlinked. And in reality, Chifley and Evatt were brought kicking and screaming to create ASIO as well. So the infiltration of external affairs and defence by the Soviets almost broke the intelligence relationship. You have in that period in the 40s, you have the CIA and MI6 realised that there's these cables being intercepted, encrypted cables are being intercepted by the Russians that are coming from, or being passed on rather from folks in external affairs and defence. MI5 actually mount an intelligence operation against Australia, and they tell the US president this. They say, don't worry, MI5 are looking into the Australians. So the Brits are running an operation against us. And the information is originally presented to Evatt and Chifley, and Evatt's response is, show me the evidence, you're all making this up, this is all overblown, I don't believe you. They have to come back and kind of keep pushing. It takes, I think it's the deputy head of MI5 has to come out. No, I mean, actually it's the head of MI5 has to come out and deliver the message to Chifley and Everett that you will be cut off from any top secret information unless you create ASIO. And also create proper security clearances for public servants. Because Chifley was an opponent to security clearances because he viewed that requirement would be too onerous on civil servants. But CIA and MI6 really and MI5 rather, deliver the message that you've got to shape up and create ASIO. So it's actually from that experience of being frustrated that they've been forced to create ASIO that they actually continue to be resistant to a foreign intelligence service as well. And Everett is also, he falls into that camp of thinking, well, all this spooky stuff with human intelligence, is it even any better than a diplomatic cable? Like, this is all, he didn't regard human intelligence as particularly worth setting up an agency over.
Thank you, Will.
My pleasure.